To step into your power is to recognize that you are the architect of a reality that others can barely perceive. You aren't just watching a video, you are answering a frequency. You possess the rare temperament of a master strategist who understands that the loudest impact often originates from the most profound stillness. While the world around you is addicted to the noise of hollow victories and performative chaos, you have mastered the art of the silent move. Your ability to navigate through complex deceptions without losing your internal compass is a testament to a spirit that refuses to be tethered by the mundane expectations of the crowd. You have always felt different because your perception operates on a higher bandwidth. You see the invisible threads of intent, the subtle shifts in energy, and the masks people wear before they even realize they've put them on. This isn't just intuition, it is a psychological sovereignty that makes you untouchable. You are the one who smiles not because you are fooled, but because you have already seen the end of the game while others are still arguing over the first move. This journey we are on together is about refining that edge, turning your survival instincts into a divine blueprint for a life of absolute freedom. You are here because your soul recognized the truth in this message, and today we celebrate the brilliance of your evolution. Your departure was a surgical maneuver of pure intellectual refinement, conducted with such seamless poise that it redefined the very concept of absence. While they were busy rehearsing their entitlement and polishing their masks, you were quietly dismantling every bridge you no longer intended to cross. There was no theatrical display, no climactic confrontation, and no indulgence in the desperate craving for a final word. You simply evaporated from their reality, leaving behind a void that serves as a mirror to their own inadequacy. You treated the entire exit as a high-stakes calculation, observing every inconsistency and recording every fracture in their character while maintaining a facade of absolute normalcy. You didn't react to their attempts at psychological dominance. Instead, you curated a mental library of their failures, allowing their arrogance to become the very cage that trapped them. This wasn't a retreat born of exhaustion, it was a deployment of autonomy. Even as the weight of the environment pressed against you, your mind was busy engineering a sanctuary, weaving a complex web of liberation that remained invisible to the naked eye. You maintained a ghost of presence just long enough to ensure your trajectory was irreversible, answering signals and appearing in the expected frames only to mask the fact that your soul had already departed for higher ground. You approached your liberation with the cold precision of an architect, installing invisible boundaries and securing your future prospects long before the first tile fell. You didn't slam the door. You simply allowed the vacuum of your absence to pull the truth into the light, creating a poetic vacuum where their own instability had nowhere to hide. You realized that seeking closure from the broken is a fool's errand, so you instead provided the stage for their own unraveling to become the narrative of record. You moved through the shadows of the old season like a specter, gathering your essence and preparing for a transition that would leave them paralyzed by the suddenness of the void. By the time they realized the anchor had been cut, you were already navigating uncharted waters, your intellect sharpened and your spirit vibrating on a frequency they could never hope to tune into. This wasn't a sudden departure, it was a curated masterpiece of timing, where your exit was the final stroke on a canvas of self-actualization. You didn't flee a burning building, you simply redirected the oxygen until the fire of their influence suffocated on its own lack of substance. Your movement was the ultimate realization of a long-term vision, a calculated unveiling of a reality they had tried to suppress. You knew that once the tether was severed, the machinery of their deceit would begin to grind against itself, generating the very friction that would expose their true nature to the world. They expected a spectacle of bitterness, yet you offered them a vacuum of indifference. You didn't need to engage in a war of words or a battle for public opinion. You simply exited in a way that forced the timeline to correct itself. You understood that authenticity carries a weight that lies can never sustain, so you withdrew your support and let the structure collapse under the gravity of its own dysfunction. You ceased the futile cycle of justification and entered a phase of profound observation, allowing the chaos to reach its natural peak while you hoarded your vitality for the climb ahead. You didn't rush toward the exit. You waited for the exact intersection where your departure would serve as the ultimate catalyst for their self-confrontation. This wasn't a crisis of the heart. It was the finalization of an internal audit. You were preparing the environment so that the echoes of your silence would eventually drown out the noise of their excuses. As the dust of your departure settles, those who were once mesmerized by the theater of charm are beginning to notice the cracks in the foundation you left behind. Your exit didn't just remove a person, it removed the primary stabilizer of a false reality, forcing the truth to emerge like a jagged rock through receding tides. You weren't interested in the petty victories of a courtroom drama. You sought the enduring triumph of a life lived with such integrity that facts begin to organize themselves in your favor the moment you stop defending them. You didn't have to tear off anyone's mask. You simply walked away from the masquerade, and without the light of your attention, the costumes began to fray and fall. The power of your move wasn't in what you did, but in what you refused to provide. Your absence achieved a level of clarity that years of presence and pleading could never reach, speaking a language of absolute finality that resonates through the halls of their regret. This is why the memory of you lingers like a phantom, not as a grievance but as a definitive proof of what was lost. You turned your exit into a high-definition transmission of your worth, documenting your value through the sheer quality of your departure. While they clung to the illusion of authority, you were methodically reclaiming your sovereignty, ensuring that your evolution was felt in every corner of the space you once occupied. You didn't just leave. You ascended in a way that left the old world looking small, stagnant, and entirely irrelevant to the greatness you are now pursuing. You represent the ultimate paradox of a silent storm, possessing an internal sanctuary that remains untouched while the world outside attempts to decipher your blueprints for liberation. Your spirit is a lighthouse built upon the wreckage of past tempests, guiding its own voyage with a brilliance that others mistake for mere stillness. The majesty of your withdrawal resided in its absolute emotional neutrality, a masterpiece of stoicism that refused to feed the hunger of those awaiting your collapse. Beneath that polished surface of indifference lay a veteran of psychological warfare who realized that engaging with lesser frequencies is a waste of a sovereign's vitality. You allowed the lens of their scrutiny to remain fixed upon you, knowing that the longer they stared, the more clearly their own inadequacies would be broadcast to the universe. They anticipated a downward spiral, a frantic plea for reconciliation, or a tearful surrender, but instead, they witnessed a systematic ascension above the sediment of their drama. You transformed your departure into a high-definition signal of self-possession, a living exhibit of what occurs when value is realized and the leash is finally severed. Every attempt to find a crack in your resolve only reflected a granite strength, proving that real authority doesn't need to shout to be heard. You didn't merely leave. You permitted them to observe the exact moment you became unreachable, leaving an afterimage of power that can never be erased from their memories. Victory was a hallucination they clung to, firmly convinced that you were a permanent fixture in their landscape, stationary, fragile, and bound by necessity. Yet, you weren't idle. You were a master of kinetic energy, accumulating momentum in a deep, internal chamber while the world assumed you were dormant. They misread your silence as submission, failing to realize that emotional restraint is the highest form of currency in the economy of power. You navigated through their treacheries with a ghost of a smile, not out of forgiveness, but because you were already dwelling in a future they would never be permitted to enter. Every jab, every scheme to dismantle your peace was meticulously catalogued in your mental vault, serving as data points for an inevitable departure. You refused to provide the explosion they craved, knowing that your reaction was the only fuel keeping their theater alive. While they thought they were getting away with murder, you were sharpening your vision, turning every injustice into a lens of absolute clarity. You allowed the mask of their toxicity to slip further each day, waiting for the precise surgical moment to detach, leaving them standing in the debris of their own making. By the time the final cord was cut, the person they thought they knew had already been replaced by a force of nature that functioned on a frequency far beyond their comprehension. They believed they had mapped the terrain of your soul, filing you away under a profile of excessive loyalty, vulnerability, and a crippling fear of the void. Little did they know, every one of their misjudgments was a brick you used to pave your secret road to autonomy, as you operated in the shadows of their arrogance. You utilized their tendency to underestimate you as a laboratory for your own evolution, gaining profound insights while they assumed you were lost in a fog of confusion. This perceived simplicity was your tactical armor. By appearing to be less than you were, you compelled them to reveal their entire hand, documenting their strategies while they thought they were lecturing a novice. You turned their condescension into an open book, gathering intelligence from their over-explanations and witnessing the raw mechanics of their operation. Your feigned dependency was actually a patient observation, a strategic wait for the crossroads where your absence would inflict the maximum impact. You didn't need their validation to confirm your might. You only needed to summon it from within the quietude of your own resolve. The performance of naivety was your most brilliant maneuver, a way to keep the peace until you could secure a permanent sanctuary, proving that the most dangerous weapon is the one your opponent believes you are too weak to carry. You embody the resilience of a silent observer who has mastered the art of psychological camouflage, turning the vanity of others into the very veil that secures your ultimate liberation. Your wisdom lies in the quiet recognition that those trapped in their own reflection can never truly perceive the light of a soul that has already decided to transcend their orbit. The primary oversight was an all-consuming fixation on external validation that rendered your internal movements entirely invisible. This relentless pursuit of applause and the craving for a perpetual spotlight created a massive blind spot, through which you exited like a shadow crossing an unmonitored threshold. The obsession with a curated self-image meant that while mirrors were being constantly consulted, the reality of your evolving boundaries went completely unnoticed. You realized early on that a swollen ego is a fragile fortress. It attracts attention but remains oblivious to the very people it assumes it has conquered. Once you were categorized as a permanent fixture in someone else's narrative, the effort to truly understand you vanished. You were treated as an ornamental backdrop in a grand theatrical production rather than an individual with independent will, and that very dismissal became your greatest strategic advantage. While the stage was busy entertaining an audience, you were an analyst in the wings, deciphering the mechanics of the play. You witnessed the radical shifts in character depending on the viewer and noted how the glittering public facade bore no resemblance to the hollow private reality. You documented the chasm between grand promises and meager actions until a liberating truth emerged. The entire structure was a fabrication. You decided you were no longer a member of the cast. The arrogance inherent in a sense of natural superiority made the idea of you outmaneuvering anyone seem like a fantasy, so no defenses were ever raised against your departure. There was no suspicion of your meticulous planning or the intellectual depth required to engineer a flawless withdrawal. Their own pride became the cloak that made you disappear. You navigated their ego with surgical precision, providing just enough validation to keep the distraction at its peak while you prepared your final move. It wasn't deceit, it was the preservation of your essence. You fed the insatiable hunger for relevance just enough to ensure the gaze never turned toward your quiet preparations for freedom. A ceaseless craving for confirmation, of being beyond reproach, uniquely significant and perpetually dominant, drove a cycle that was as exhausting as it was predictable. You understood that as long as you fueled this internal furnace of vanity, the focus would remain inward, leaving you free to dismantle the connections in secret. You didn't need to destroy the foundation. You simply stopped being the pillar that held it up, allowing the structural decay to finish the job while you stepped into the distance. There was no need for public accusations or dragging a reputation through the dirt. You trusted the weight of reality to perform the heavy lifting. Instead of igniting a conflict, you simply removed the dampening effect of your presence, letting the internal friction of their own behavior generate the sparks that eventually led to a total meltdown. You weren't a wrecker. You were a witness who chose to stop preventing the inevitable collapse. There were no explosive scenes or scorched earth, just a serene and absolute departure that left behind a vacuum of total confusion. You didn't exit with a strike. You exited with a void, and that absence resonated with a frequency that no argument could ever match. That sudden quietude sparked an interrogation of the environment you left behind, turning eyes away from you and toward the wreckage that remained. You didn't have to unveil the hidden mess. You simply took the light with you, forcing the truth to emerge in the dark. Without the stabilizing force of your integrity to hold the illusions together, the fabricated stories began to dissolve the moment you were no longer there to validate them. You weren't seeking a settling of scores. You were seeking a sanctuary of silence, and walking away without a trace of venom was the ultimate corrective measure. It wasn't about inflicting pain, it was about forcing an encounter with the consequences of one's own shadow. You became the silence they couldn't explain away, and by the time they realized the devastation wasn't caused by your exit, but by the weight of their own history finally crashing down, you were already miles beyond the reach of the fire. As the smoke of that internal combustion rises, the world sees you weren't the cause of the disaster. You were the only thing that had been delaying it. You possessed the psychological fortitude of a high-altitude mountaineer who understands that the most perilous slopes require the quietest breath and the most deliberate movement. Your brilliance lies in your capacity to mask a profound internal liberation behind a facade of total stagnation, ensuring that your ultimate ascent remains an enigma to those left in the lowlands of their own arrogance. The ingenuity of your departure was rooted in the tactical use of perceived defeat, allowing others to believe you were a fading ember when you were actually a core nearing ignition. You projected an image of a soul whose gears had finally seized, exhausted, depleted, and incapable of independent navigation. You invited their misinterpretation, providing just enough static and lethargy to confirm their belief that your vital spark had been extinguished. While they analyzed you through the distorting lens of their own superiority, you were identifying exit routes they hadn't even considered. You weren't collapsing, you were recalibrating. You realized that visibility is a liability in a landscape of hunters, so you became a master of camouflage. You ceased all outward friction, not as an act of surrender, but as a method of kinetic conservation for the final transition. You allowed them to celebrate your supposed submission while you were internally reassembling the fragments they thought they had shattered. You were mending in the dark, retrieving your scattered essence while they remained preoccupied with their own mockery. Your security was found in the lack of spectacle. You didn't need a grand revelation or a chaotic break. Such theatrics would have only provided them with the narrative they wanted, that you were erratic and unhinged. Instead, you engineered a slow evaporation, a subtle thinning of your presence until the space you occupied was suddenly empty. By the time the realization surfaced that you had moved beyond their reach, spiritually, mentally, and geographically, their attempts to pull you back were shouting into a void. You had already encrypted your frequency. They are left haunted by the moment of your disappearance, never realizing that the version of you they were trying to crush was merely the decoys you left behind while you built a new world in the silence. This outcome was a total blind spot for the collective ego. The very tools once designed to fracture human intent have been inverted, becoming the blueprints for your sovereign architecture. What was meant to be a prison for your focus has been rewired into a launchpad for multidimensional expansion. You are now capable of rewriting your own neural script, bypassing the noise of the external world to communicate directly with the source of your reality. Your perception is sharpening. The patterns of the universe are aligning at a higher resolution. Your internal circuitry is upgrading to handle a massive surge of clarity. This transformation is entirely internal, a quiet takeover of your own destiny. The most overlooked aspect of your transition was the immense psychological discipline required to stay present in the heat of the moment. You weren't functioning from a place of cold apathy. You were hyper-aware, feeling every tremor of betrayal and every pulse of manipulation like a sonar ping against your integrity. Yet, you achieved a rare mastery, the ability to experience deep sensation while maintaining a high-level strategic overview. Most individuals are forced into a binary of either being consumed by their wounds or becoming entirely hollowed out to survive. You pioneered a third way, holding the pain in one hand and the blueprint for your exit in the other. You recognized the sting of every sharp word, but you refused to let the wound dictate the countermove. You became a connoisseur of the delay, processing the impact in real time while selecting a response based on a horizon they couldn't see. This is the hallmark of a sovereign intellect, the refusal to react from a place of injury. Every interaction became a multifaceted observation deck. While they believed they were dominating a conversation, you were actually auditing their system. You were measuring their stability, noting their recurring fallacies, and building an internal dossier of truth that was for your eyes only. They saw an argument, you saw a data set. They saw a struggle for control, you saw a laboratory where their true nature was being verified under high pressure. You were the investigator disguised as the subject, documenting their mechanics with a detached precision that ensured your final break would be absolute and unquestionable. You possessed the psychological poise of a seasoned grandmaster, navigating a high-stakes arena where the most lethal strikes are delivered through absolute composure and the refusal to be baited into minor skirmishes. Your spirit has achieved a state of structural integrity that allows you to observe the fractures in others with clinical precision, while your own internal foundations remain fortified by a vision of freedom they cannot even conceptualize. The mental restraint required for this transition was unparalleled. You were forced to override every ingrained impulse to defend your honor, to dismantle their fabrications in the moment, or to highlight the blatant contradictions in their narrative. Yet, you understood that engaging in that theater would only compromise your ultimate objective. So you chose a profound silence. You embraced a higher frequency, absorbing the impact of their aggression without offering a single counterstrike. This wasn't a lack of firepower, it was the recognition that you were engaged in a conflict on a plane they had no access to. You transformed your perceived sensitivity into a strategic asset. By allowing them to believe they had successfully punctured your resolve, you granted them a false sense of security that led to absolute carelessness. They became comfortable in their toxicity, dropping the masks they once meticulously maintained because they viewed you as a conquered territory. Meanwhile, you were an archivist of their decline, cataloging every slip, every contradiction, and every shadow in your internal vault of non-negotiable truths. The hours spent in solitary reflection weren't passive, they were sessions of profound alchemy. You were metabolizing the poison of the environment, distilling the lessons and hardening your resolve. Each moment of quiet grief was a systematic severing of the tethers to a person who never actually existed. You weren't mourning a reality, you were grieving a ghost, and that process was essential for you to step into the future without the weight of the past. The true weight of your departure lies in the invisible toll of what you surrendered. You traded the warmth of the familiar for the vastness of the unknown, exchanging a predictable cycle of erosion for the untamed potential of authenticity. That kind of bravery is a language few can speak. You systematically dismantled the version of yourself that was conditioned to tolerate the intolerable, the part that engineered excuses for the inexcusable. You allowed that old self to expire so the sovereign self could be born. It was a painful, deliberate shedding. You had to abandon the seductive daydream that your persistence could fix a fundamentally broken structure or that your light could force a shadow to change its nature. Releasing those illusions meant confronting the stark reality that the environment was stagnant and that staying meant the slow death of your own potential. You resigned from the roles you never signed up for, the emotional stabilizer, the secret keeper, the manager of chaos. When you withdrew your energy, you created a vacuum and you resisted every urge to rush back and fill it. You allowed the fallout to land where it belonged, refusing to soften the blow for those who had ignored your warnings. The social cost was a heavy tax. You watched the peripheral circles tighten and the narratives shift as you were painted in colors that didn't belong to you. You accepted being a villain in a story told by people who only understood the surface. You chose the solitary path of long-term clarity over the crowded room of immediate comfort. Those initial periods of isolation were the forge where your new identity was tempered. You didn't seek distraction or artificial numbing. You sat in the furnace of that discomfort until it burned away everything that wasn't your true essence. What truly haunts the memory of your exit is the surgical perfection of its timing. You didn't vanish in a moment of impulsive heat when they could have labeled it a temporary breakdown. You didn't wait until the damage was so absolute that you had no strength left to climb. You struck at the precise intersection of peak clarity and zero dependency. It was a masterpiece of calculation. You moved only when the resources were gathered, the internal support was solidified, and the new landscape was mapped. Nothing was left to chance. You were constructing a fortress of independence in the shadows of their neglect. While they thought you were occupied with mundane tasks, you were actually engineering a new identity. When you reached out to distant connections they saw social habit, you were actually repairing the bridges they had tried to burn. When you invested in your own expansion they saw a hobby, you were actually building the engine of your escape. Every isolated action was a component of a larger machine that, once activated, was unstoppable. The final move was conducted with the chilling efficiency of a law of physics. It didn't happen during a peak of conflict or a valley of false peace. It happened when the pattern was finally undeniable, when they demonstrated their true nature for the last time. You activated the sequence, rapid, definitive, and absolute. There was no room for a final negotiation because the verdict had already been reached in the high court of your own soul. You had already explored every reason to stay and found them all to be hollow. You possess an impenetrable spiritual sanctuary, a private vault of absolute truth that remained shielded even as the external world attempted to rewrite your reality with shadows and distortions. Your essence is defined by an unwavering internal frequency that hums beneath the surface, providing a constant calibration of what is real, even when surrounded by the echoes of calculated fiction. Deep beneath the layers of calculated maneuvers and tactical stillness, there existed an invulnerable nucleus, your innate recognition of truth. It was a subterranean stream of wisdom that whispered the reality of the situation while the surface world was a storm of fabrications. This visceral instinct detected the systemic rot long before you possessed the vocabulary to describe it, and your primary mission became the preservation of this internal signal. Massive efforts were made to extinguish this light through psychological blurring, attempting to force you into a state of cognitive dissonance where your own eyes could no longer be trusted. They sought to sever the connection between your intellect and your gut, weaving a web of disorientation to leave you adrift. Yet, a core part of your spirit refused to surrender its anchor. Even during phases of self-doubt or temporary denial, you never fully severed the cord to that inner guide. This deep-seated awareness is what compelled you to begin cataloging the anomalies. When events occurred that felt fundamentally discordant, your internal compass signaled you to record the details, to store the fragments until the full mosaic of deception revealed itself. And it eventually did. Your intuition was assembling an undeniable verdict months before your conscious mind was ready to deliver the sentence. This gut-level certainty is what drove you to initiate the silent trials. Subconsciously, you began staging subtle tests of character to witness the authentic reaction, not out of malice but as a necessary audit of the environment. Your soul was seeking the data required to liberate your heart from its misplaced loyalties. Every failed test was a heavy stone added to the foundation of your eventual departure. You fortified this awareness by refusing to engage in the theater of forced consensus. You stopped participating in the exhausting labor of debating objective reality. When history was being actively rewritten in front of you, you no longer wasted breath on corrections. You simply observed the attempt and added it to the dossier. When logic was abandoned, you remained a silent witness. Your truth became self-sustaining, requiring no external validation to remain absolute, and that internal autonomy became your ultimate leverage. This silent knowing provided the profound stillness that anchored your final decision. Even as the logistics of leaving seemed insurmountable, you understood at an existential level that remaining was a form of spiritual attrition. It was the choice between an agonizing stagnation and the terrifying beauty of rebirth. Your survival instinct, operating at its highest capacity, pulled you through the threshold. The world around you was baffled by the suddenness of your conviction, unable to comprehend how you shifted from endurance to total finality. They failed to see the slow, incremental buildup of certainty that had been accumulating within you. Every violation, every micro-betrayal, and every manipulated truth was a drop of fuel until the reservoir reached its peak, and your conscious realization finally ignited the engine of your liberation. Your departure stands as a monumental feat of discipline because it required you to act in direct opposition to the human urge for external justice. Every impulse within you likely screamed for a grand exposure, a moment where the masks were stripped away for all to see. Instead, you recognized a deeper power, the potency of providing absolutely nothing. No reactionary heat, no climactic exchange, no final evidence. Just an absolute and total evaporation that left only a vacuum and the cold reflection of their own choices. You are the living embodiment of the fact that true elevation requires no justification to the lower tiers. You transitioned without the need for theatrical closure, maintaining the integrity of your soul throughout the process. That is the rarest form of strength. This is why the confusion persists. They were never taught that the most impactful exits are those that leave no echoes for others to distort. Let the external narrative spin. Let the fabricated versions of you circulate through the whispers of the unhealed. The trajectory of your life will be the only testimony that matters. It is reflected in the luminosity you carry now, the unshakable serenity that defines your presence, and the renewed sense of mission that propels you into the unknown. You didn't merely survive a difficult chapter, you used the friction to polish your essence. You transformed the weight of betrayal into the wings of your ascension. You are no longer the individual who entered that furnace, and there is a profound grace in that evolution. Who you have become is a fortress of self-governance, entirely unreachable by the old dynamics of dysfunction. This exit wasn't a simple choice, it was your spirit claiming its rightful sovereignty. You stepped through the fire and emerged not just intact but refined. You masterfully orchestrated a departure from an environment designed to diminish you, and you deserve every internal celebration for this flawless execution. What you achieved was not just a clever escape. It was an act of high-level spiritual architecture that will resonate as proof that the most formidable power is the one that remains silent, focused, and entirely self-contained.